Hi, everyone. We're going to get started now. I just want to welcome everyone to the Social Infrastructure and Housing Affordability Breakout Room. I'm Michael, and this is Samit. We both work at Waterfront Toronto, and we're going to be helping to facilitate the session today. We're also joined by Alexis, Ariel, Johanna, and Annie from Sidewalk Labs. And before we get into the content, I just want to quickly go over the agenda for this session. We're going to start with social infrastructure. Waterfront Toronto will give a bit of context, then Sidewalk Labs will go into their proposals, and then we'll do the same for housing affordability. Then we'll have a 5-minute Q&A on both of those pillars, followed by kind of breakout sessions at all the tables where you can discuss and give your feedback on what you've just heard. And then we're going to wrap up with a 5-minute report back of the discussions at the table. And so just to kind of give a bit of context and background on the work that Sidewalk's been doing in the social infrastructure pillar. As you heard Meg discuss this morning, the Central Waterfront Secondary Plan has kind of 4 core principles. And I just want to mention this last one, creating dynamic and diverse communities. And this is something that Waterfront Toronto has really tried to do in all our projects. And we've done this by providing affordable housing. We have the Waterfront Toronto Employment Initiative, which is a program for under and unemployed individuals. And we've really tried to create kind of a diverse set of vibrant community amenities throughout our neighborhoods. And if you look at some of the City of Toronto's plans, you see these things echoed as well. The first bullet kind of speaks to preserving and strengthening the range and quality of the social health, community services, and local institutions located downtown. This is in the City of Toronto official plan. When the TO course work was done, there was a study specifically on community services and facilities that kind of went into more detail, identifying 5 important sectors, where they should be in different areas downtown. And also some of the challenges with providing these, such as the rapidly growing downtown population and how expensive it can often be, given how scarce land is downtown to provide these services. And it suggested certain strategies around this as well, such as partnerships, co-location opportunities, integrated facility models. So here's just a map. It's not complete. It just kind of identifies some of the major facilities, but as you can see in the area, there's a number of childcare facilities planned. These are planned facilities. There's a rec center planned. The TDSB has an elementary school planned for the East Bayfront, but it's not funded. And the Toronto Public Library will be building a new district library at Front and Parliament. So just to wrap up, when we released this RFP, we really thought this was an opportunity to go above and beyond what we had done in terms of building mixed income, mixed-use neighborhoods. And as Meg mentioned earlier, we have a set of objectives that really we're going to use to evaluate the MIDP. So these are the outcomes we want to see in this area. We want the project to be, have a commitment to principles of diversity, equity, and inclusion across all facets of the project. We want it to align with the TO Core Community Services and Facilities Study. We want to see a commitment to the Waterfront Toronto Employment Initiative, including a 10% hiring commitment. And finally, we want to see the creation and funding of a sustainable trading program focused on emerging technologies. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Alexis and Ariel. Ariel.
Thank you so much, Michael. Hi, everybody. My name is Ariel Kennan. I'm the Director of Civic Innovation at Sidewalk Labs, and I'd also like to introduce you to my colleague, Alexis Wise, who's our Director of Health and Human Services. Thanks for joining us to hear about more of our proposals around social infrastructure. As Michael alluded to, social infrastructure refers to a network of places, organizations, and supports that shape our day-to-day lives and interactions. Typically, when we think of social infrastructure, we think of important community spaces like schools, libraries, and community centers. Sidewalk Labs aspires to build a healthy urban community where all people can thrive throughout their lives. Social infrastructure is key to this vision. This means ensuring that people have access to arts and cultural activities and opportunities for creative expression, that they feel like they belong and have a voice in their community, and they are able to access learning opportunities not just as children, but throughout their lives, and that they are able to lead healthy lives and access services that help to keep them well. So, as we think about the future of Quayside, we are envisioning social infrastructure spaces across the site. These dedicated spaces for community use are an important part of our vision for the STOA space you heard about earlier this morning. Spaces for arts and culture, civic life, and health and community services will be integrated into parcels 1 and 2. And a Toronto District School Board and Toronto District School Board and primary school and childcare center have been cited for parcel 5. As we think about social infrastructure, we take 3 key elements into consideration. First, as you just heard, we want to ensure there are places dedicated for community use in Quayside. These spaces should be designed both to deliver key services, but also to bring people together. Second, these spaces should be run and programmed by local organizations who understand the local context and have desire to innovate. And finally, we believe that there is a role for digital tools to complement these spaces and services. Community-focused technology can facilitate in-person meetings, support coordination of services, enhance access to services, and improve people's experiences. So let's dive into each of these 3 elements and some examples from our work to date. First, let's explore some physical spaces dedicated to community health. Our neighborhoods are critical components of our overall health and well-being, and everything about where you live can positively or negatively impact your health, including spaces and services available. We were interested to better understand the future of community health and how neighborhoods that could be places that supported people to stay healthy. We spent several months visiting with Torontonians in their communities and consulting with health and community service organizations. This human-centered approach to research uncovered a lot of great ideas about how to build social infrastructure to support health and well-being. One of the exciting takeaways from this work was to imagine these 6 future community spaces that could support health. For example, we imagined a doctor's office that felt more like a home, and a sanctuary space where you could break from urban life and disconnect for a while. We also imagined a health resource library where you could go to learn about and check out new digital health tools, and a community health prototyping space where innovators could share their ideas and get feedback. These are all very early concepts and meant to start a conversation about what the future of community health and well-being can be. We look forward to sharing more ideas with you and also getting your feedback. As we think about service delivery, it's important to know that Sidewalk Labs will not deliver health or education services in Quayside. Rather, we are excited to work with local and innovative organizations and government agencies to deliver services that can serve Quayside residents and workers, as well as visitors from neighboring communities. We recognize that there are many innovative service delivery organizations working closely with the communities in Toronto's downtown. As one of the most forward-thinking library systems, we are excited to explore collaboration with Toronto Public Library. They're a beloved Toronto institution, beloved by all, and the library can play an integral role in community programming, service delivery, and fostering community connections. TPL is building a new district branch, which Michael mentioned, and we've begun discussions about how to extend this reach of this branch into Quayside. Finally, we're also excited about bringing technology solutions to Quayside. These solutions can help improve urban and civic life and contribute to the city's overall social infrastructure. For example, we've been working with Digital Public Square, a project that's grown out of University of Toronto's Monk School, on a digital tool that increases community influence in more convenient and personalized ways. In our initial prototype, community members can influence the programming of public spaces at Quayside through exploring trade-offs and sharing ideas and suggestions. In this screen, a community member has chosen yoga, a farmer's market, and a music festival, and can then see feedback about the choices that they've made. So today, we've shared just a taste of our ideas around health, civic life, and learning. And these ideas will continue to evolve as we work with all of you and local partners to be fully responsive to the wide range of community needs of this new neighborhood. So we look forward to hearing your questions as well as your feedback today in the breakouts, and we'll be around throughout the day to hear from all of you. Thank you.
Welcome. My name is Samit Aluwalia with Waterfront Toronto, and I'm working on the housing affordability pillar at Quayside. As mentioned this morning, Waterfront Toronto is a tripartite agency, which means that we are funded by all three levels of government, but that effectively means that we are responsible for the best interest of the Torontonians, Ontarians, and any Canadian that really has a vested interest in how our waterfront grows. Central to this, and especially pronounced in today's climate of housing affordability, is Waterfront Toronto's affordable housing mandate. Our mandate is to ensure that we set aside sufficient land to accommodate 20% of new residential units as affordable rental housing, and we tie this back to the City of Toronto's definition for affordability. To date, and under our mandate, we have created a little shy of 500 rental units with an additional 80 units under construction. In 2018 alone, City Council approved an additional 500 units of rental housing, affordable rental housing, in our designated waterfront area. These are homes for seniors, families, artists, and equity-seeking groups, and are operated by agencies like Toronto Community Housing and the nonprofit sector. With this in mind, let's turn our attention to the 12-acre Quayside site. Quayside can be broken down into 5 distinct parcels spanning 2 different zoning bylaws. What's important to know about this site is that there are several regulations that speak to affordability. There's the Central Waterfront Secondary Plan, the East Bayfront Affordable Housing Delivery Agreement between Waterfront and City of Toronto, and 2 zoning bylaws. These regulations, coupled with Waterfront's mandate for affordability, means that at the core of Quayside is a commitment to affordability. You can view these regulations as a sort of base layer guiding affordability. Looking at the objectives we've established for this pillar, you will note that Waterfront Toronto is looking for an affordable housing program that delivers affordable housing with minimal reliance on public sector funding, exceeds our minimum mandate in perpetuity, ensures that there is sufficient purpose-built rental as mid-range, and again, we tack that back to the City of Toronto's definition, ownership units that allow access for housing for all income groups, mixed income buildings with a variety of housing types and sizes, with a particular focus on family-sized housing. And we'd like to see that cost savings achieved from new construction methods are contributed to overall housing affordability, so to tie it back to affordability. These are the bases on how the Master Innovation and Development Plan will be evaluated for the housing pillar. I'd be happy to speak on this in more detail, but in the interest of time, I'd like to pass the microphone over to Joanna Greenbaum and Annie Koo from Sidewalk Labs to speak a little more about the proposed housing program.
Thank you, Sumit, and also thank you for not raising the microphone as you are the tallest speaker today. My name is Johanna Greenbaum. I'm the Director of Planning and Development at Sidewalk Labs. I work on housing affordability with my colleague, Annie Koo. You'll be hearing from both of us today about our housing program, which Jesse Shapins in the plenary session previewed for you all. We'll be going into a little bit more detail and walking you through our approach. So I also want to thank everybody for being here on a Saturday morning. I know that this is a busy time of year and you all have a lot to do for the upcoming holidays. So to start off, I thought it would be important to talk about the dynamics that are at play in the Toronto housing market today. Many of you guys feel this on a day-to-day basis, and if not you, your family members are probably in some phase of what we have termed the Toronto housing gridlock. That means that it is difficult to establish a household, whether you're a young person trying to rent an apartment separate from your family for the first time, or if you're trying to make that leap into home ownership. Both of those stages and everything in between, moving around and transitioning housing, is difficult here. And the reason for that are driven by these 3 main factors. The first being Toronto demographics. Toronto is a thriving Tier 1 global city. There are 1 million people that are going to be coming here between today and 2041, and that's an amazing point of pride. Newcomers from around the world want to be here. They want to come to Canada, and most of the immigration to Canada comes right here to Toronto. That means that we as a city, have to start thinking about how you accommodate for that growth of an additional 1 million people, and that can present some challenges and some tensions that we're feeling in the housing market today. The second piece is the development landscape, and I'm happy to delve as deep as others want to afterwards here. But there are, as you know, increasing housing prices while wages are remaining relatively steady, if not the same. There's record low vacancy in Toronto today. It's about 1%, which is lower than New York and Chicago, LA, many other cities other than, I think Vancouver is the only city that has a lower vacancy rate than Toronto. That contributes to that lack of ability to move around and easily transition, and forces people to be really competitive for even to establish their first rental apartment. And then, of course, the condo versus rental fact that has been at play over the last couple of decades in the Toronto market. Over the last 10 years, there have been more cranes. There are today more cranes in Toronto than there are in Chicago, New York, and LA combined. There's a ton of construction happening, but over the last 10 years, 76,000 of the 76,000 condo units have been built, while approximately only 2,300 rentals. That's a huge disparity, and it's part of what contributes to the lack of mobility in the system. If there aren't places for people to rent at a reasonable average monthly rent, then the system begins to get jammed and gridlocked. And then finally, affordable housing policy. Toronto and Canada have had periods of a lot of government support and participation in the creation of affordable housing. Unfortunately, that sort of started to wane about 20 to 30 years ago. And today we see a resurgence with the National Housing strategy and the significant steps forward that the city's Open Door program has taken. And there is a renewed interest in government participating in affordable housing. But there is a period of time where where the city sort of lacked that participation, and therefore a lot of affordable housing didn't get built. I wanted to go over our objectives and guiding principles. The first is really important. We believe in a mixed income and diverse community, and that is something that has been a Sidewalk core principle since even before we started looking to this project in Toronto. We believe that mix of income should be across the entire community, and it should be at the building level. Now, every building will have a different mix of affordability in it, but that there should be buildings that have deep, affordable, middle income, and market rate all combined. It's very important that what we are trying to do here is scalable, sustainable, and acts as a test bed. So the program that we put forth, and then we'll go into more detail, is what we believe through a course of study with local economists and really taking a look at the housing market, is the program that we think, if applied at scale, could start to unlock some of that gridlock. Again, on a 12-acre site at Quayside, we're not going to solve Toronto's housing problem. It's not like when the project is done, everyone will declare victory and feel relieved, take a big sigh of relief that affordable housing has been solved in the city. That is not the goal. The goal is to demonstrate a program that mixes tenures and typologies, rental and ownership, affordability levels, to create the formula that will help Toronto unlock some of these housing tensions that we're all feeling. We will provide new options. Again, that means tenures and typologies. We'll be talking about providing an option that's between renting and owning. We call it shared equity. The solutions that you'll see presented today are very specific to Toronto. Every place is different, and we've spent a lot of time analyzing, learning from local housing providers, understanding the local ecosystem here, and trying to craft a solution that's specific to to those conditions. Again, we're not the end-all solution, as we just covered, and importantly, that this project and this program is dependent on partnership between the nonprofit sector and government, as well as the private sector. We need those three components to be working in tandem in order to achieve this. I don't know how many of you are familiar if these three maps look familiar to anyone, but they reflect the work of University of Toronto professor David Hulchansky, and they represent sort of income distribution over the course of time in the city of Toronto. The important takeaway here is that the yellow represents the middle income households. And as you can see from 1975 to 2015, that yellow becomes less and less on the map of Toronto. And this map has only become less yellow in 2018. We see a lot of high and low incomes, but the middle, or what is sometimes referred to as the missing middle, is getting pushed out further and further through longer commutes and into geographies that are farther from the central core. Our program, somewhat uniquely, is going to try to address this shortage of housing for middle-income households. And so I want to give a quick overview, and we'll go into more detail, but 40%, as Jesse mentioned in the plenary, 40% of our program overall is below market. 20% of that program is considered affordable by the official plan and City of Toronto government standards. That is based on average market rent. That's the government standard. And 20% of our program will meet that standard. A quarter of that program, or 5%, will meet deep affordability requirements at 60% or below of AMR. And then importantly, we are providing this middle income tranche at 20%, which of our overall program, which again is to accommodate these Torontonians that really aren't accounted for under the current definition of affordability in Toronto, but for whom there is no place to live in the city, no affordable place to live in the city. And this is the beginnings of how we've started to build a foundation and to ultimately achieve our mixed income community. I'm going to hand the presentation over to Annie Koo, my colleague, who will take you through what we propose.
All right, so building on Johanna's point about more affordable and middle-income housing, we are also proposing a program that is made up of at least half purpose-built rental. And we know this is important because of the significant disinvestment in purpose-built rental housing over the past several decades. Johanna already quoted this stat about only 23 to 2,400 rentals coming online in the last 10 years. We've seen a shift in this in the last year. I think there is renewed commitment to creating rental housing, but it's not enough, and we want to make a dent in that. We know it's not enough because there is this purpose-built rental gap that still exists in Toronto. And by that, I mean almost 50% of Torontonian households rent, but the stock only has about 25% of rental housing, meaning that there is not enough stock to meet that need. And so by providing a program or pitching a program that is 50% rental, we are really seeking to make a dent in that. Next, I want to talk a little bit more about the more housing options that we're proposing for families, singles, and seniors. So we spent a lot of time as a group, and I actually see some folks in the audience who have participated in some of these, learning more about Toronto families, how they live, what they believe in, what they value, hosting roundtables on vertical living. And so a result of this is a commitment to more options. And so I'm going to talk about 3 of those today. We're thinking through a range of typologies and tenures, as Johanna mentioned. And so first is this shared equity model, and we're proposing about 5% of our program be shared equity. And this is a new tenure model that's sort of an alternative to just exclusively renting or owning that helps you bridge that gap. So we think of it as sharing ownership with a potential nonprofit or other independent entity that allows you to buy what you can afford and rent the rest. This allows someone who can't afford a full down payment to put down less money, but still build equity on the part that they own. And so we see this as sort of an important step toward home ownership, and it would be considered an affordable home ownership option in this case. Importantly, I think it also details to be worked out, but also helps us ensure long-term affordability of the units. Next, we've made a commitment to family units, and by that we define that as 2 bedrooms or more, because we know, as seen from those maps, it's hard for families to often stay in the city, particularly when the stock is smaller condo units. So this commitment to larger bedroom units is our effort to try to build housing for families or larger households that seek to have them. And then lastly, we're also exploring the role of co-living in our program. I think today we often think of co-living as something that's a little bit reserved for young professionals, but we really believe that more communal supports would actually be almost most impactful for seniors seeking to age in place, and also families who would benefit from those community supports that might not always be available in a community that's more of a single-family housing sort of neighborhood. And so exploring this with our partners to think through how co-living could play a role in our program. We're estimating that at about 5% of co-living units. So I just want to end on this note, which sort of brings together what we've talked about here on housing, which is that we're proposing a commitment to 40% below market housing, which is comprised of 20% affordable housing, including a commitment to a quarter of that being deep affordability, which equals about 5% of the total. 20% of that will also be middle income housing, which is a mix of both rental and ownership. That ownership piece is referring to that shared equity model that I mentioned. 50% of our program, separate from that, is proposed to be purpose-built rental housing. And then lastly, a commitment to 40% 2 bedrooms or more units with the families in mind. And I just want to end on, I think this is our thought process on what the housing at Quayside could look like. And we believe this sort of more options, creating more options for people of all incomes is really critical to creating a complete community. So thank you.
We'd like to earmark some time for a short Q&A session before we get into our breakout groups. Open the floor. Sir.
Sorry, I'll hand you a mic, but can I just ask as well that you just keep it to one question because we only have 5 minutes. We want to cover as many people as possible.
For the average market rate, is it going to be based off of like 2021, 22, or is it going to be something more along the lines of now or whenever you sell or whatnot?
Yep, that's a great question. So those would be rental numbers, and they would be set at the time that the buildings are completed and constructed. So those rents or average market rent is set every year by CMHC and for the City of Toronto, and they do adjust over time. Right now, they're at a range for 1 bedroom between $786 and $1,311. And I know that may ring differently to different people, but that is the average. Another question? Yep. Oh, you with the scarf, yeah.
Is there anything within the plan addressing questions linked to homelessness?
Thanks for your question. So some the 5% deep affordability component could address the homelessness population, depending on which nonprofits we partner with and what their missions are. But there is no formal shelter or institutional solution to homelessness on site.
Can anyone here speak to your lobbying activities at the federal level with the Public Health Agency of Canada?
Thanks, Bianca, for your question. I defer to my colleagues, but I doubt that they can. Nope, and so that can be answered afterwards. Thanks.
With little reliance on public funding, how are you going to ensure that the developers that are building the purpose-built rentals, that they will not be luxury rentals, since that's their profit-making model?
Right. So the goal for the purpose-built rental portion of the program is to have that service the entire full range of incomes, inclusive of deep affordability, middle income, and market rate. So in the affordable and middle income ranges in particular, where the rents could be very sensitive, we would have a rental agreement with the city like many other developments do around town. But the goal is to have the community be truly mixed, and therefore we need both high, middle, and low incomes.
So you are relying on public sector funding?
Public participation would be part of our program, yes. What did you say? Sorry, I couldn't hear you. Governments? Yeah, if you could give the microphone or... I believe your question was sorry,
It's
Michael.
how do we get the public sector stakeholders to play
Okay,
along?
Great. Thank you, Michael. So we've, throughout the process of the last few months, have been working with the City of Toronto, as you heard in the plenary session, through the Waterfront Secretariat's office. We've been meeting with various agencies who are relevant to each individual to our pillars. And we've gotten good reception to our program. We're also speaking to the federal government up in Ottawa, and they're also very excited about the project. But as you say, it's in the details, and the moment that we actually execute the program. So we hope that the excitement continues.
We have time for just one more question.
Okay. So I think this was sort of touched on in the last question, but I'm wondering, you mentioned how some of the affordable housing may be implemented by agencies like Toronto Community Housing Corporation. So I'm wondering, is that included in the 5% figure, and how does that line up with the 60% of average market rate? Because that's sort of a different funding model than often social housing tends to adopt.
Thanks for your question. That's a really good one. So I think you're referring, TCHC was actually on one of the earlier slides. They do a wonderful job delivering social housing. The 5% would specifically be in collaboration with nonprofits, which TCHC actually considers itself one, but it's not necessarily them. We haven't selected any nonprofits that we will be working with. The important part of that component and the partnership with nonprofits is that today in new developments, nonprofits are very often, if brought in at all, brought in at the very end, and they don't have a chance to be part of the design and the early stages of the process. So they're handed a product and like asked to work with it or forced to work with it. And on the flip side, the design and soft costs of a project can often be very expensive on the budgets of some of these really lean nonprofits who are trying to deliver housing at the most affordable, the greatest levels of affordability that they can, and so they don't have a lot of money and resource to hire architects and respond to RFPs and all of that. So our goal is to design a process where we can bring them in early, but not force them to take on a lot of those initial costs before a project is solidified, but that their input can be incorporated into the building from the get-go and not sort of an afterthought once you're already underway and under construction. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much. And just before we jump into our breakout session, a point of clarification. If you refer back to the objective slide that we did talk about, I think someone raised the question about public participation. A big part of this project is partnerships, but we want to make sure that everyone's aware that there are a set of objectives that Waterfront Toronto does have. So through the process of the MIDP coming through, along with the business and viability plan, everything will be held up against those objectives. Thanks so much. Let's open up the group to the breakout.
Hey everyone. I don't want to cut the discussion short, but we are running out of time, so we need to get started with the table report back. Samit's going to come around with a mic, and we're going to try and do a report back from each table. However, we only have 5 minutes in total, so if you can try to keep it to under a minute, that would be great. And just looking for a report back on discussion at each of the tables. Thank you. Hi, everyone. Sorry, we're just trying to start with a report back. So if you could wrap up your discussion so the first table can get started, that would be great.
Go ahead, guys.
So, answering to the first question, we are very interested in knowing more about how this shared equity idea will work. I think that sounds great, but we would like to know how this is going to be actually implemented. Also, having diversity in mind and how this different housing will accommodate different incomes and how they will live together. I think that will be very interesting to see. Creating those community spaces where we can integrate with other ethnic groups or age groups, I think that will help create that sense of community in the neighborhood. We also considered maybe the idea of you moving into the neighborhood from your family being a single man and maybe choosing to cohabit with someone else, and then maybe deciding to partner and then move into a different or a shared space, basically having your life, the cycle of life happening in this neighborhood. Could be interesting to entertain also that idea. We also think that it will be important to, considering that we have many immigrants and newcomers arriving into the city, to have a space dedicated to their families or friends that are coming to visit them, that it is within the neighborhood, so they don't have to spend money or lots of money to find hotels in other areas. We thought that there was some security was missing in the talk. We would like to know more about what are the safety and strategies that you can include in the design and the development of the project. Things such as how to avoid getting our bikes stolen, and yes.
Great, thank you.
So a key thing we talked about is normalizing barrier-free access within units, because often what happens currently in the city is that cheaper units tend to have barriers, and I mean that's sort of what happens when you have this dichotomy. When you have features that are in a certain amount of demand, you end up paying more, and disabled people who are in need of barrier-free access are the people who are least likely to actually be able to afford these. So the idea of normalizing barrier-free access within all of the rental units, so that you don't end up effectively paying what we tend to call a crip tax, in order to just find a place where you can actually physically get in and out.
Great, thanks.
I don't know, are we allowed to mention more than one point? Or? Okay. So, God, sorry. Yeah, we also talked about how this relates to legislation. So the idea that things get approved without being fully accessible, that's something that will be a challenge because the AODA is not sufficient in terms of accessibility. So there needs to be a recognition that the AODA compliance is not sort of a sufficient goal. We also talked about the issue of homelessness and how that relates to accessibility. So the thing is, with hostile architecture, it makes things inaccessible for homeless people, but it also tends to make things inaccessible for people with chronic pain, people with chronic fatigue. So we discussed the idea of basically making public spaces friendly for people who have unconsciousness, altered consciousness, people who need to sleep. And I mean, recognizing that housing is the goal, but also that we're not going to be able to solve that problem. So how can you make public spaces friendlier and safer for people who are going to be unconscious outside? And then also address the idea of sort of convertible indoor-outdoor spaces that can sort of adapt to the weather and basically create that sort of friendlier environment for people who don't have a set home. So, yeah.
Great, thank you.
So our group spoke a lot about defining affordability and how the definition of the average market rental may not be as accurate as it should be. If all of these rental or rates are coming from CMHC, chances are they're overinflated due to the source of those figures, not capturing some of the more affordable or cheaper apartments in Toronto. We talked about how Sidewalk Labs should consider the issue of property taxes and how that might end up being a barrier to actual affordable home ownership, because property taxes are set by the city, and this property being like a downtown prime region, the property taxes would naturally be higher, and that could be an issue. And we think one key thing to really provide affordable housing is providing an environment where you can work where you live, providing people with an overall affordable lifestyle as opposed to just housing, ensuring that there's enough opportunities for people to remain in the neighborhood, should that be their choice.
Hi. We already talked about a lot on affordable housing, so we'll maybe touch on other points if that's okay. We like the idea of really integrating schools and community centers and whatnot into the entire development project, so that anyone from being a baby to being a senior citizen can enjoy learning, because learning is part of life, and it's almost missing out in a way that's never really been touched on a regular life day-to-day basis. And we also wanted to know, how is this tie into TO Core? Because there hasn't really been touched on, when it comes to social infrastructure, how is everything really tie into standardization? Is a lot of the ideas going to be transferred towards other places, and how other places within the city can transfer some of their ideas to Quayside?
Great, thanks.
We talked about some of the other points that everyone else did talk about. One of the, just to draw on the point about communities and services, if it's going to be a mixed income neighborhood, we thought that there has to be a kind of like a cultural shift for people to actually live together in harmony, and that means having services for marginalized communities there, and for instance, mental health, sexual health services there, and partnerships to be developed. We were a little bit confused, I guess, as a group, because we didn't have some details in terms of how much is the land that is being developed? Is it being bought? Is it being given to Sidewalk Lab? And that kind of really sets the tone for the development. But we did discuss that. Then it came up, criteria for ownership. What would it be? Why did you choose only 5% deep affordability number? Where did that come from? And also, what government subsidies are you going to be using? And we thought, if this is being dubbed as an innovative project, since it is already happening throughout the city and other places in Ontario and Canada, that it should be affordable in perpetuity, and not the 15 years mark that is usually mandated by the city. And then we just thought there just needs to be more details out there about the shared equity in terms of homeownership, and also the last thing, we thought that there needs to be more public consultations that are accessible, especially in neighborhoods around the city where the people that could benefit from affordable housing can be more involved.
Great, thank you. And the affordable housing in perpetuity is one of our objectives. It's on the, we went over them very quickly, but I think there should be handouts on the table.
Brief report back from our table. We discussed the importance of places of worship, synagogues, mosques, churches that play an important role in community building and providing services and social spaces, and how this is going to be achieved in this waterfront community. We talked about finding ways to addressing the missing middle in terms of providing rental and home ownership opportunities for folks that have enough money to pay fairly high rates in rent, but don't have enough money to actually purchase. We talked about some discrepancies between statements made here about there are no plans to address the aspects of health. Meanwhile, we know that you are lobbying at the federal level under the subject of health. So how do we square this? And then again, I think the question of like, how do we achieve like people that rent here? Will they be rent in perpetuity, or will there be like ways established to sort of moving from rent towards home ownership? And then lastly, like the question that I had was like, again, coming back to the terms and conditions of the land sale or the land acquisition. Most developments that I'm familiar with, when we reach discussions that we have here, where we talk about percentages, we talk about housing, rentals, affordability, middle income, affordable, and so on, that is done when you have a good idea about the costs in terms of, the costs for the land, the cost of construction, and all these kind of things. Now I was told there is no, there are still negotiations going on around the acquisition of this land, and I wonder how you can have these discussions without actually having accounted for all the necessary factors, particularly as the land sale is concerned, or lease, or however this will be structured. So I would be very happy to learn much more around the actual terms and conditions of how the land is being made available to you, and how that factors in what is able to be produced on this land.
Great, thanks.
So our table talked about some of the issues with partnerships with the not-for-profits in the community, how the digital complements overlap or not with city portals, more integration of social infrastructure for seniors and co-living, and I think, more affordable housing, which sort of the other groups have touched upon. I don't know if anyone else wants to add anything.
It's okay, great, thank you so much. And thanks everyone. And if you have any additional questions, you can always find any of us milling about.